This is The Secret Lies Within, and I'm John Trevelyan. Hi, and welcome to a regular segment where we discover the wealth of creative energy and hidden talent in and around Great Dunmow. Because for a small town, there's a lot of ordinary people doing some pretty extraordinary things. For our first show, I interviewed true crime writer Linda Stratmann about her books on Essex Murders and her new female detective novels set in Victorian London. I recently met up with Linda at Talliston House Gardens to discuss her work. So, what made you write about Essex Murders?
Well, after my first book for Sutton Publishing, they started a new series called The County Murders, and they asked me if I would like to write a book in that series. So I said straight away I wanted to do Essex. This was because there were two cases I especially wanted to write about. There was the one in Buckhurst Hill, and that is an absolute Victorian melodrama which I just stumbled across by chance when browsing old newspapers. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was the Great Dunmow case. This is unique in British criminal history. So at the time I was told that the Great Dunmow case was too recent for a history book. But a few years later, they asked me to write a follow-up, more Essex Murders, and I said, I will, but only if I can write about the Great Dunmow case. And this time had moved on, so they said yes.
Right. I mean, how do you choose the murders and cases that make it into your book?
Well, first of all, I searched through my own collection of true crime books, which is quite substantial. I spend a lot of time going through newspapers to find cases. I make a lot of use of searchable, digitised historical newspapers, which are an absolute boon. Mm-hmm. What I'm looking for is new stories with exciting events and interesting characters. People think sometimes that I'm looking for gruesome murders, but what I really want are human interest stories with preferably a nice twist in the tale.
Mm. So when you've assembled this list of possible cases, I mean, are there any cases you want to include but you had to leave out? I mean, you mentioned the Great Dunmow one because it was too recent for the first book.
Yes, I aim to do 10 stories in each book, but I start with a list of about 12, and then I just have to make the decision as to which ones to leave out, which is often quite hard. One I wanted to write about was the Moat Farm case, but I decided not to because I thought that's really a subject for a full-length book. And in fact, since I wrote Essex Murders, somebody has done a full-length book on the Moat Farm case.
Right, okay. I mean, in the second book about the county, more Essex Murders, which you mentioned, you had this very interesting case from Great Dunmow. I mean, obviously, we're going out to the Great Dunmow community. I mean, probably a lot of people wouldn't actually know that much about it. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, it's about a man called Willis Bowshears, and he was an American airman. He was stationed at Wethersfield Air Base, and he was living in a flat in the close Great Dunmow. Now, his wife Jean, she was Scottish, and she was staying with her family. She'd recently given birth to their third child. So on New Year's Eve 1960, he had nothing to do, and he went out drinking, and he met a local girl called Jean Constable in a pub, and a young man called David Salt. He invited them back to his flat for drinks. Mm-hmm. David Salt took a taxi home. Jean decided to sleep over. Well, Bowshears later said that he had fallen into a drunken sleep, and the next thing he knew, he found he had strangled Jean. He panicked, and he dumped her body in a lay-by near Ridgewell.
Right.
Well, there wasn't any doubt that he'd killed her. He admitted it, but he said he'd done it in his sleep and had no memory of it. So he was given this wide range of psychiatric tests, an ECG. Everything was normal. He didn't have a sleep disorder. So at his trial, his defence was that he had killed Jean while he was in his sleep. So the jury had this very, very difficult decision to make. In the end, they gave him the benefit of the doubt and they acquitted him.
Right, okay. I mean, that's really fascinating. I mean, what is your take on the case?
Well, we know that he was very drunk that night. My thought is that he probably made advances to Jean and she turned him down. He tried to quieten her so as not to disturb the other flat dwellers, and I think quite unintentionally strangled her. I think he genuinely couldn't remember what had happened because of post-traumatic stress, and so it really seemed as if he had just woken up out of a sleep.
Yeah. So what other cases are included in these books? I mean, what particularly did you find fascinating to research? You said you look for really interesting human stories.
Yes, well, in Essex Murders, I mean, one I'm particularly fascinated by is Sarah Chesham of Clavering. She was a notorious poisoner, a really cold-hearted woman. She had a nickname. They called her Sally Arsenic. She used to give the local women advice on how to get rid of unwanted husbands. And since I always like to find cases that are local to me, the Hyams Park murder of 1922, this has actually got a Great Dunmow connection, because the killers, a young man and woman, fled, they got married, and they spent their honeymoon on a pub crawl in Great Dunmow. They then went to hide out in a barn at Bocking, and they swam in the local river. The wife rather shocked the locals by swimming in a costume made of handkerchiefs tied together, which in 1922 was a bit racy.
Yes, indeed. It's fascinating that obviously you have to do a lot of research. You've said about looking at digital newspapers or going to the British Library. I mean, do you actually go and visit the sites?
Yes, if it's still there,
yes,
I go and I take pictures. In fact, a lot of the pictures in my books, pictures I've taken myself. If it's a specific house which is still occupied, a private home or a pub or something like that, I always ask permission first. I usually find that pub landlords are very happy to have a picture of their pub in a book.
Yes.
Some sites take quite a bit of research. The Ridgewell lay-by, where the body of Jean Constable was found, that took a lot of driving around and searching before I eventually identified it from press descriptions. I try and contact the officers of churchyards when I'm taking pictures of graves, so there's someone there who can show me around and point out graves if they're still visible. But otherwise it's often trudging through muddy woods and muddy paths and things like that.
Yeah, which is a very different idea that people have about people just sitting in their comfy offices, like writing about this stuff.
Yeah.
So how many books have you written in total now?
Well, I have 15 published books. 3 of them are fiction. I've just completed another fiction book, which will be out next year, and I'm working on a new non-fiction project. Right.
And what first got you interested in crime specifically for your writing?
Well, my mother was always very interested in history, and she loved reading about famous trials. And I remember as a child we used to watch Edgar Luscott on television, his true crime programmes, and we were both absolutely fascinated. As soon as I was able, I started collecting books on crime.
Right, okay. And how many books do you think you have in your collection? Do you know?
About 1,000.
Really? Right.
That's just the crime books.
Yeah.
And I've got history books as well and so on.
So you had this fascination with crime. I mean, how did you start actually writing?
Well, I've always written for my own amusement, so it must have been a kind of a natural thing I wanted to do. The first thing I ever wrote was a poem when I was 6. But quite some years ago, a friend of mine was editing an amateur magazine, and I contributed some articles about crimes. But then I found a subject that I felt needed a full-length book. This was a case of a Victorian poisoner, Adelaide Bartlett. She poisoned her husband with chloroform, got away with it. So, just off my own bat, really, I researched and wrote a book. This took me 3 years. And then at the end of that time, I sent it to Sutton Publishing. Although they didn't want that book, they commissioned me to write The History of Chloroform, which is my first published book.
Right. So when you're not walking about in muddy woods looking for, looking for sites, I mean, where do you do your research?
Well, I do a lot of research in the British Library. There's the National Archives, which has got all the Home Office and Prison Service records there. The Essex Police Museum have been very, very helpful indeed. And I travel, if necessary, to any other archive that has got the records I want. I think the most interesting visit I ever had was to the Royal Archives, which is in the Round Tower of Windsor Castle.
Right.
I subscribe to online genealogical archives. There's a website where you can download or read old out of copyright material, which is absolutely perfect for the historian. There's a British History online access website. This is a thing called the Victoria County History, which is absolutely marvellous for local details. I get copies of old maps, and yeah, so everything that is necessary, every angle, every aspect is covered.
And so, I mean, obviously with the internet coming to the fore, I mean, this has helped you immensely, I would have thought, because other than that, it would have been actual, written or, typed paper records, wouldn't it, before the internet?
Well, yes. I mean, the website, it's archive.org. You can actually see on your screen scanned copies of historic books which otherwise I would have had to have gone to the library and got them out and either copied or typed out details. I mean, that has just saved me so much time. It's and of course the online census returns.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've mentioned that you don't just write sort of non-fiction true crime, because you also mentioned in your list of books that you've got a series of non-fiction novels. Can you tell us a bit about those?
I'm writing a murder mystery series. It's set in Bayswater in the 1880s, and the main character is a lady called Frances Doughty, and she's a detective. She has a stalwart assistant called Sarah. Somebody said recently they're like a female Holmes and Watson, and actually that was what I had in mind when I started writing. I've just finished the fourth one in that series.
Right, okay. And what are the titles of those?
The first book's called The Poisonous Seed, and then there's The Daughters of Gentlemen, Case of Doubtful Death, and the latest one is going to be called An Appetite for Murder.
Right. I mean, you've mentioned Holmes and Watson. Obviously, the characters are the things that are really amazing about those books. Can you give us a portrait of your character?
Well, at the beginning, Frances, she's very young. She's only 19 in the first book. She's working as an assistant in her father's chemist shop. She isn't pretty. She hasn't got any money, but she's got a very good brain and tremendous determination. Sarah is a strong, loyal servant from a tough East End family. Practical, no nonsense. And then over the course of the books they acquire some new friends, some of them quite unconventional, and they help them in solving cases.
Right. And just, I mean, it's the unusual quality of having a female detective, isn't it, that's that I find fascinating about the books. Could you tell us a bit about the struggles that she goes through in...
Well, with Frances, of course, because she's a young female, it's difficult for her to be taken seriously. She's constantly being told that she should be off trying to find a husband instead of getting involved in these kind of things. In fact, she's told that not only should ladies not be involved in solving crimes, that they're constitutionally unsuitable for doing so, and this will never ever happen. Right. And also there are certain subjects that people need to talk to her about that they're very hesitant to talk to her about because they're a bit indelicate, and she has to really force the information out of them. But she is very, very determined, and she will get her man eventually, or woman, as it may turn out.
What made you start writing fiction over non-fiction? I mean, obviously you went into write a book about chloroform. How did that develop into the fiction writing?
Well, I'm a member of a local writers group, and I suppose really it was their example, because most of the people in the group wrote fiction, and I just thought I would do this. I wanted to write the sort of book that I wanted to read. And so that was why I wrote about a Victorian subject and a lady detective. And also I wanted to try and make it feel real. I wanted to make it feel as if you actually sense that you're there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And which writers inspire your work? I mean, who do you read?
I've always admired the writings of P.D. James and Ruth Rendell, because I think they produce these perfectly crafted mysteries. And of course Agatha Christie, she was this great expert. Plotting, misdirection, red herrings, absolutely superb.
Yeah, and they do stand up the sense of time because they're so well plotted.
Yes.
Even though the settings are quite dated, the actual sort of mysteries are still very, very well written. And that's obviously in the crime fiction. What other writers do you read for relaxation?
One thing I've noticed quite recently is that writers who write in a very specific genre, when they want to relax, they read something different. So, for example, I actually don't read novels with Victorian settings by other writers. Part of the reason is I'm always a bit worried that some idea will come up in the book and then 6 months later it'll pop into my head and I'll imagine that it's my own idea. So I don't want to do that. So I tend to read modern thrillers. So, I mean, at the moment I'm reading a book by Lee Child. I've just finished a book by Stuart McBride. They're a complete contrast to what I write. I like the very atmospheric, spooky books by S.J. Bolton, and also clever plotting, Robert Goddard and Jeffrey Deaver. I really do enjoy their books.
Right, well, thank you for joining us here at Talliston, and good luck with your new works.
Thank you very much.
The Secret Lies Within was produced by me, John Trevelyan, with the support of Talliston House Gardens. It's a project where ordinary people have taken an ordinary place and transformed it and themselves into something quite extraordinary. Find out more at talliston.com.